Hey guys, today we are going to combine Mccall's M7997 to Mccall's M7994, and I'm going to first determine the sizes I'm going to cut. So for the first pattern, I'm going to just cut the skirt. So I'm trying to find the hip measurements, which here I went to 44, which is a size 20. So I'll be cutting a size 20 from that. And then Mccall's M7994, I'll be cutting a size 16, which has the same bust measurement as I do. I also will be cutting a size 16 in the sleeves as well. So I can go ahead and alter those. Okay, so I've traced off my pattern, and I've also transferred over my markings and figured out where my bust line is. Now I have my measurements here. You can pause this to see exactly all the measurements that I take. But the first thing I'm going to do is measure the new bust line that we just found. I'm going to measure that and see how wide the front bust is, which is 11.5, which obviously twice, because this is a half of the front, will be 23, which is perfect in size for me. But we have to take into consideration that this pattern does have 5/8 of an inch seam allowance built in. So it is actually 5/8 of an inch too small. So I'm going to put a check here. And later on, I'm going to note that I need to add 5/8 of an inch. Now I am closing my dart here at my waistline, and I'm measuring from my waistline to the edge, to the side seam there, to take that measurement, and it is the correct measurement as well. And then I'm going to measure my shoulder and compare it to my shoulder measurements, and that is correct as well. So this pattern is actually quite good fitting for me. Now I'm going to take my shoulder measurement and divide that in half to get where my princess seam line will be. And then I am going to take my nipple to shoulder measurement of the pattern, which I think this is like 10.25 or 10.5, which is a little bit too small for me, but I didn't end up moving it because with the right undergarments, with the proper undergarments, my bust actually will sit at that amount. So I didn't change a thing, but I did mark it here on my paper. So the next thing I'm going to do is measure from my bust point here, my apex point, to my center front. And I'm measuring that because I need to know what the apex to apex measurement on this pattern is. And it said it was 4 1/8, which doubled would be 8 1/4, which is corresponding with mine. So I put a check there. Now I need to see how long waisted this is. So I'm going to measure from my bust line down to my waist and to see what that is. And I believe it was 7, which is long-waisted for me. So I'm going to note that it is long-waisted here next to my waist measurement. 7 1/4, yeah. So we'll go ahead and deal with that in just a little bit, but I want to make sure we're getting all of our measurements. Now I'm measuring my front chest, which is usually about 3.5 inches down from the base of your neck, and that corresponds with my measurements as well. So there's not a lot of alterations that need to be made to this pattern besides the waist. If you guys do have more tricky alterations that need to be done, you can always leave a comment down below with a question and I'll make sure to get back to you. So here I'm just taking away the seam allowance and making a note here at my bust line as well as at my waistline that I need to add that extra 5/8 of an inch to make it correspond with my measurements. And I know I may get a question about how the pattern says that it was the correct 41.5 that my bust actually is. But what the pattern does is it takes the bust measurement and it divides it in half. And it puts half on the front and half on the back. But when you are a C cup or higher, your bust takes up more in the front than it does in the back. So that's why I do it this way. So now I'm moving on to my corrections that need to be made. So remember, my waistline was 7 1/4 here on this pattern, but my actual waist is 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure up from my lengthen and shorten line 1 1/4 inches, and I'm going to move my waist up. Make sure that when the pattern gives you the lengthen and shorten lines, make sure to bring it over to your traced copy because it is important for making alterations. Now I'm going to cut on the actual lengthen and shorten line, not on the new line that we drew, but the actual lengthen and shorten line. And I'm going to move that up to meet the new line that we just drew. And then I'm going to remeasure it to make sure that I didn't flunk in math to make sure everything's good. Now that we've moved our waistline up, now we need to fix our dart. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure how wide my dart is. And then I'm going to square line down from my apex and then redistribute that dart fullness on either side of that middle line and then reconnect my dart legs to my new points there. So basically we have the same amount that we're taking up, but we have to move it over a little bit because we've moved our waistline up. So now I'm going to retrue my dart, and you do this just by closing the dart legs and then drawing a straight line connecting your center front to your side seam. And notice that there's a lot of extra going on here at the bottom, and that's only because we moved the dart over slightly. So we have to recreate the line at the bottom here, which will be straight when the dart is actually sewn. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to cut that out. Now I am adding in that 5/8 of an inch that we need along my side seam, making sure to go with the contour of that dart that we have there. I don't want to mess with that. It's already trued, so I'm just going to add the 5/8 of an inch here. And I usually use a centimeter, but since the pattern already had 5/8 of an inch, I decided to just go with what it had. I want to quickly go over what I did for my bodice back. You've seen me do the bodice front, and the bodice back is so much simpler, so I didn't show it on camera. But pretty much what I did, let me get up, was the first thing I did was I raised my waistline. Remember how we did in the front? I raised the waistline by 1.25 inches. I cut it out, I taped it. The next thing I did was measure without my seam allowance. I measured the amount that I needed for my back, because remember, we have our full bust front here, and in order to get this fit perfectly without having to do a full bust adjustment, you want to take your bust circumference minus your bust front, which is what we have here, and you get whatever the balance of that, you divide that by 2, and that's how you get this. So I think mine was like 9.5. So I measured out my seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. I measured out 9.5, and then this is my new center back line, and then I re-added on the seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. Then I measured in from my center back line. So this line here, I measured in what my apex was. Remember here, our apex is 4.25 here. This is my measurements, so 4.25. So I measured that 4.25. I cut my dart out and centered it along the 4.25 line here. So that's what this is. I retrued the dart. And then the last thing I did was measure out my seam allowance here, and I measured from this point to this point and made sure that was the length of my back, which is 15, and it was, so it fit perfectly. The next thing you want to do is just make sure that this side seam fits back onto this side seam when the dart is closed, and it does. So now I have a perfectly fitting bodice block, which should fit me absolutely perfectly. And now you want to go ahead and make a mock-up of this. Okay, so now that we have a bodice block that we know fits as well, now I'm going to start our pattern alterations here. So what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is take off the seam allowance. And the reason why I'm taking off the seam allowance is because our fabric that I'm using has stretch, and this bodice block is made for woven non-stretch fabrics. So I want to take the seam allowance off so we have that negative ease there. So our new seam line is going to be 5/8 of an inch in from our old seam line, if that makes any sense. I hope I didn't confuse you guys as much as I confused myself when I said it. Anyway, so I'm doing that and just connecting those lines there. Now I'm measuring down 1 inch from my neckline. So I'm going to lower my neckline 1 inch, and then I'm bringing in my shoulder about 1 centimeter as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and connect those with my French curve. I'm also going to measure in 5/8 of an inch for the new line that we drew and move my triangle back. And with those quick adjustments, we could go ahead and cut our pattern out so we can get ready for some dart manipulation. Before I start moving around my neckline and everything, I decided to go ahead and draw my facing out. So I'm just tracing out my neckline that I have now, and then I'm just extending it 2.5 inches, and that's going to be the length of our facings here. Now, in hindsight, I probably would have lined this instead of used a facing, because I noticed that when I'm wearing this, the facing kind of wants to flap out a bit, and you can't really make it longer than 2.5 inches. So I think it'll be better if you went ahead and lined this with a thin stretch lining. Okay, so now that I have my facing drafted, now I'm going to go ahead and move around my waist dart. So now I'm starting with the outer leg of my bust dart, and I'm drawing a line to meet my apex, and then I'm going to draw another line from one of the legs of my waist dart, and I'm going to draw that line to meet the apex as well. And then I'm going to snip into those up onto the apex line, but I'm not going to snip through, so that we can get like the pivoting action there, so that we can swing some of this fullness from the waist dart closed into the bust dart. Okay, so I'm going to start with my waist dart, and I'm going to go ahead and swing half of it closed, and then I'm going to place some tape. I'm also going to measure the remaining balance of that waist dart, and I'm going to take that away from the side seam. This is creating that slanted side seam look that I want. I've also taped some additional paper into the space that we opened up in our bust dart, and I'm going to connect the top of that dart to my new side seam, and then I'm going to redraw in my dart legs and make sure that it is actually facing the right angle towards my apex, as well as making sure it's the correct distance away from my apex, which for me is 1 inch. Now I am closing my dart to true it. So since we added that extra fullness to our bust dart, we need to go ahead and retrue it. And you true a dart by closing in the dart legs and then kind of cutting straight, so that when it's closed it's straight, and when it's open it looks like this. So all of that extra fullness creates a straight line when the dart is actually sewn. Now let's move on to the back. So I've just retraced a copy of the back onto some more brown paper, and then I'm kind of doing the same thing similar to the front. So I am drawing straight lines through one of each of the dart legs, and then where they connect, I am snipping up to that point so that I can have pivoting there. And then I'm going to close my shoulder dart. I didn't want a shoulder dart in this, so I decided to go ahead and close it. Now I'm aligning my side seam of the back to the side seam of the front, and I'm just placing a mark there, where the side seam stops, because this is going to be virtually backless. So I want to make sure that my back piece is lining up to the front. Next, I'm determining how wide I want my button clasp there in the back. So I'm just measuring down my seam allowance, and then I'm trying to figure out how wide I wanted it, and I decided for 2 inches, and then I'm just going to add my seam allowance on back to the bottom there. So now I'm going to add seam allowance to the bottom of the side seam as well, and then I'm going to draw a line connecting my side seam to my center back. And then you also want to make sure that you're accounting for the side seam allowance. So I kind of drew that in, and then I'm going to take that away, because remember we took it away from the front because our Lord have mercy, I can't talk today, because our fabric has stretch. So now I'm accounting for that seam allowance there and drawing a straight line, and then I'm going to connect the side seam, my new side seam, to the center back. And I'm also going to measure out my seam allowance on the center back line and just reconnect that line, because you need it to kind of look like the way it looks here, because all of that, the extraness there that kind of makes a straight line, is going to be eaten up in the seam allowance. So now I've created this wonky little dart here. And the reason why I'm not worried about this dart is because this dart is going to help me cinch in this angled portion here, because this angle is on the bias, like 100% on the bias. So I decided to swing my shoulder dart into the bottom of this piece so that I can easily close in that fullness, and I won't have to worry about it not being fitted to my back. This dart really makes sure that the pattern is fitted to my back. So this is essentially my back piece, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a facing from this. Like I said previously, I would rather, if I made this again, I would line it with a thin stretch lining instead of making facings. Facings are just annoying. And then I remembered that I took in some, a little bit off the shoulder, so I had to readjust that and then readjust my facing. Not a big deal, slightly annoying, but not a big deal. So I just went ahead and readjusted my facing to match, and then finished that off. Okay, and that is our bodice completely done. I have my back and the back facing, and the front facing. Okay, so I'm sorry, excuse the background noise. I just wanted to explain this to you guys really quick, and it's going to be hard to explain it with the voiceover. So what I'm doing now is I have all of my skirt pieces cut out. So piece 9, piece 11, 11A, and then 10 and 10A. So what I'm going to do is measure my waistlines. And make sure that you're measuring on the actual waistline marking and not the edge, because that's what seam allowance. So you want to measure your waistline, and then you want to make sure that your waistline on your skirts match up to the bodice that you guys just drafted. And that is it for the pattern drafting portion of this project. Stay tuned for my next video where I'll show you guys how to make this dress from start to finish. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next one.